Today I wanted to, I think, come back more to reproductive health and justice and families and communities and, organizing, that resistance. Alice Walker has a book, Possessing the Secret of Joy, and this may be a spoiler alert. At the very end of the book, what is the secret of joy? It's resistance. And so every one of you that's coming to this panel has been involved in the work of serving your community, helping women and families resist. These have been some of the themes of the class. So I want to invite you, maybe each of you, to speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we can have some dialogue.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. My name is Sophie Krasik, and I am the co-founder of Envy on Campus, which is a national organization that assists campus sexual assault survivors in holding their institutions accountable to gender discrimination laws and ensuring that they are not discriminating against their students. And Rape on Campus, basically I'll be talking about a lot of the different policies and laws that we have been using to hold institutions accountable, and in the last couple of years, how students have used these policies and these laws to advocate and form a larger national movement. So it'll be primarily talking about the various laws and how students have used those. In Rape on Campus, we assist students with filing these federal complaints. And also, if students don't want to file federal complaints, we also help survivors in whatever way that they need. So if that's like connecting a survivor with a pro bono therapist or a pro bono attorney, or just connecting survivors to other survivors in the area or at that school, we just work with survivors and their families so that they feel supported in whatever way that means to them. And then also, more broadly, we work with policymakers on the local, state, and national levels to hold schools accountable. And also, we develop new policies for specific schools. And we're also working to create a national frame related to sexual violence on college campuses, that this isn't an issue that affects any particular region more than another, that this is a national problem, and it's not isolated to any one particular campus. So, sorry, this is a little small, but basically some background is that over the last couple of years, a lot of attention has been brought to the issue of campus sexual violence, and a lot of that started when students at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, filed a federal Title IX complaint against their school without the use of an attorney. So I'll talk more later about what Title IX is and how students can file these complaints without attorneys. But basically, they decided to file this complaint and also to pitch it as a story to the media and say that this is an issue that has happened at all of these different colleges all around the country. So they actually created that map, which is of the US, and all of the little red dots are schools across the country where there's been coverage of sexual assault cases. So that really kickstarted a lot of the most recent wave of activism that's been seen on this issue, although obviously this is an issue that's been going on for a long time, and people have been advocating against campus sexual assault for decades. This is just a different recent wave that has happened. So in March of 2013, the New York Times put this photo and an article about campus sexual assault activists on the front page. And that really caused a lot of people to reach out, including myself, to the two activists in the photo, and who are students from UNC Chapel Hill. And then at Berkeley specifically, which is where I'm a student, we had a student government bill that was passed, a bill of no confidence in UC Berkeley's disciplinary procedures that was passed shortly after we had started realizing that this was a systemic issue that was happening to survivors across campus. And the administration got really angry about that, and eventually we filed a Clery Act complaint, which is another law that I'll talk about in a minute, and then also a Title IX complaint. So since then there have been actions on the federal and state levels to hold schools accountable. So federal legislation is currently pending. It would institute mandatory campus climate surveys at schools, and then state legislation like Yes Means Yes in California was passed and signed into law in September of last year. And then actually more recently in March, a bill for consent education in high schools in California was introduced and was passed unanimously by the, I believe it was the Education Committee in the Senate. So there's stuff moving on that too. So some common problems of campus sexual assault and institutional betrayal on college campuses are that schools have an incentive to keep these cases covered up. They don't want to have the reputation as being a school that has a problem with sexual violence. And so in practice, oftentimes you'll see that there aren't good investigations that are being done. You have administrators trying to discourage survivors from reporting. Administrators, if they find the assailant responsible, giving them really light sanctions that are just completely ridiculous, like a book report or 50 hours of volunteering at a rape crisis center. Yeah, completely ridiculous. So things like that. And also just the lack of communication and transparency from the universities too. So you'll have lots of times where the survivors will reach out to the university to try and figure out what's going on with the case, and then the university will just ignore it. And the hope with that is that the survivor or the assailant will graduate and therefore won't be able to do anything. So the institutions benefit from this usually four-year turnover, and the lack of institutional memory, and that people have to often start from scratch. And that allows them to not hold the perpetrators accountable oftentimes. And also just the lack of faith in students in the reporting procedures is perpetrated by this, especially for marginalized communities, and that there are very little incentives for people to report because of all of the institutional barriers to reporting. And also just retaliation is another big problem, and administrators lying about the consequences for reporting and saying, well, we take false reports very seriously, or saying, well, nothing's going to come out of this anyway, you shouldn't put yourself through this, things like that. So it's important to know the law, because a lot of times that's how universities have gotten away with this behavior, is that they have relied on people not knowing that there are discrimination statutes in place that can be used to help protect students. So Yes Means Yes is one of the more recent laws that's been passed here in California specifically. So it mandates that there's a conscious, affirmative, voluntary, non-coerced agreement to engage in any sexual activity, and that it can be revoked at any time. And that standard is for colleges to use in the adjudication process, and that's for both public and private colleges in the state of California. So that actually passed and created a lot of momentum for other states to also institute these types of standards. So there are other states that are looking into this as well.
There was also a documentary made about this process too, right? I've seen it somewhere. Did anyone else? The Hunting Ground.
Yeah. So
yes.
Yeah, so the Hunting Ground is about the movement against campus sexual violence. They don't talk about affirmative consent in the film because they wanted to focus on the institutional betrayal aspect of it. But yes, this has gotten a lot of press.
Does that we read a book called Yes Means Yes? Does that have anything to do with it?
So basically, Jacqueline Friedman and Jessica Valenti popularized the term Yes Means Yes, but the activism happened independent from them. Okay. But they popularized the term.
Oh, cool.
And also, yeah, dating relationship does not constitute consent, and lack of protest or resistance also does not constitute consent. These are things that have to be written into the school's policies and have to be followed. So Title IX is really awesome. Basically, it is this anti-gender discrimination statute that was passed back in 1972 as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act, and it has since expanded through case law, so it's actually like only 3 sentences long. It just prohibits discrimination in education on the basis of sex, but it has since just through case law expanded to cover gender, and also so basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity, gender or sexual orientation now as well, and also prohibits sexual harassment and sexual violence, and prohibits a hostile environment from existing on campus without the school addressing it. So basically this is a really big statute that is very broad, but in recent years has come to cover even more things under the reasoning that sexual violence and sexual harassment predominantly impact women, so that constitutes a type of discrimination in education. So the Clery Act is another really important federal law that was implemented in the early 1990s. So basically it's primarily for statistics and ensuring that schools have to publish these campus crime statistics, but also it gives survivors a Bill of Rights. So this was passed as an amendment to it in 1992. And so it says that you, as a survivor reporting to the school, have the right to be notified of the option to talk to law enforcement. That doesn't mean you have to talk to law enforcement, but it gives you they're supposed to give you the option. You also have the same opportunity, both the survivor and the assailant have the same opportunity to present the case. So a lot of times at schools you'll see that like 5 different meetings happen between the assailant and the administration, and then they work it out on his terms, and then they say, we'll just suspend you for 3 days or whatever, something stupid. But the survivor only has 1 meeting with the administration. And so that is an unequal opportunity to present, because you have the assailant having way more time to talk and give their side of the story. So that would be a violation of the Clery Act. Other things that are covered under this are that survivors are supposed to be notified of counseling services. Survivors are also supposed to be notified of the options for academic and living accommodations. And survivors are also supposed to be notified of the outcome of any disciplinary proceeding. So a lot of times schools will hide behind FERPA, which is a privacy law for education, and they'll say, oh, well, we can't disclose the outcome of this investigation because it would violate FERPA. But actually, that is not true because of the Dear Colleague letter, which is guidance that was issued from the Department of Education on the intersections between the privacy laws and the Clery Act and Title IX, and basically clarified what institutions are supposed to do and how they should respond to these cases. So some of the highlights from the Dear Colleague letter are that the universities are supposed to use what's known as a preponderance of the evidence standard. So a lot of times you hear about the beyond a reasonable doubt standard in criminal justice, but actually in schools they're supposed to follow preponderance of evidence, which means it's more likely than not that the sexual harassment or sexual violence occurred. So that's like 51% as opposed to like 99% certainty. And so schools theoretically should be able to find assailants responsible with more frequency than in the criminal justice system. So that is something that was clarified in the Dear Colleague letter, which is really important. Also, they are supposed to make the procedures easy to understand, so it's supposed to be accessible language that students don't have to read through like a huge long policy that doesn't make any sense because it's all legal jargon. It's just supposed to be simple. Also, the resolution of a case is supposed to happen within 60 days. So that's not required, but it is the recommended timeline from the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education. So a lot of times you also see schools draw out cases where they don't resolve them for maybe a year or a year and a half, or they just completely forget about it. And so this is supposed to provide a framework for those schools. And then also, you'll see schools say, oh, well, law enforcement is investigating, so we're not going to do anything. But that is completely irrelevant. It's a separate process. The criminal justice system can't tell a school to expel or suspend a perpetrator. That is within the school's jurisdiction. And also, if you aren't looking to report, but you're looking for academic accommodations or living accommodations or just support services in general, that's something that you can only get through the university. And so that's why you have to have that infrastructure in place that's trauma-informed and supportive to survivors. And also, Title IX is supposed to protect students regardless of whether they're on campus or not on campus. A lot of times schools will try and say, oh, well, the perpetrator went to a different university or wasn't in a university, or this happened off campus, so it's irrelevant. But Title IX, specifically as clarified in the Dear Colleague letter, is supposed to protect students, all students, whether they are engaged in an educational, extracurricular activity, or whatever it is, as long as they are engaged in some sort of educational setting, if it's like a field trip or whatever, then they are covered by Title IX. And so that's also something that's also really important. So basically there's been a lot of activism around this issue and filing complaints and saying that there has been a hostile environment on my campus where the university has been deliberately indifferent to systemic sexual assault. And basically students have been coming together and putting together their narratives and looking at how Title IX and Clery were violated, and then sending them to the Department of Education. So now 106 schools are being investigated by the US Department of Education, and there's been a lot of media attention around this issue. And also the Hunting Ground came out recently too, which is about this, the movement against sexual assault on campus. So what we're working for is for more equitable resources, for survivors to be supported, for it to be a fair and impartial process that's not biased in favor of rapists and sexual assailants, to make sure that there are appropriate sanctions and that serial perpetrators aren't allowed to get away with it with the frequency at which they are right now, and just the basic right to be safe and get an education on our campus. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So hello everybody. I always wear some kind of shawl. I come from a Lakota tradition. I was raised biculturally, so I thought everybody was when I was growing up, because I would be in South Dakota and I'd hear Lakota language, and listening to grandmothers all talk. I remember the kneecaps because they'd all be sitting in a circle and I'd be on the floor, and just kind of listening to them talk, and being outside and not wearing shoes a lot, because we were outside, and just being among people and being very safe that way. And then I would go back to, to Alaska or wherever my mother was working, and I'd be in white society, and it was the complete opposite. So I thought everybody had two completely opposite lives. And one of the things that I learned, or one of the things that I brought with me, is that the shawl itself, if you ever see Native people, women from the plains wear a shawl, and the shawl has fringes on it, and that was given to us, or we created that for the protection of the grass from the earth. That's what the fringes represent. And the plains women would wear them, and it was like wrapping the earth around you, because we are the earth. We are related to her, we're connected to her, and we have that knowingness, right? Well, I do actually have my shawl in my car, and I take it with me a lot, but it's in more informal circumstances. I use other shawls. So this one I especially brought because of the water. It rained last night. I don't know how many of you were up praying and giving thanks and listening to it, because how often do we get to hear that symphony anymore, So that's kind of been my focus, and you know, last week we did a healing water walk over, you know, along the refinery corridor, and there's going to be another one on May 16th. So in other words, what I'm saying is we put our bodies, our minds, our spirits together because it's all related, as you all are aware of. I know with spending time with Teresa, I know you know that. To be able to heal, to help her to heal and to help ourselves to heal, because it's all connected. So I came here today because I came from that two ways of thinking, and always, my mom was brilliant because she did make me go to other schools and she did teach me another way so I could navigate the society in a fairly good way. Half the time I feel like I'm failing at it because what do we measure the society by? Toys.
Possessions.
The letters behind your name, you know, what you have. And so on the one hand, I feel like, boy, I really screwed up because I don't have any retirement, I don't have blah, 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 I don't have any letters behind my name. But on the other hand, I've managed to carry with me and live in a traditional way, even though we're in this violent place that grew up around us. My grandchildren right now are in a hard situation, which kind of repeats the situation I was in when I was growing up. So our families itself started from a very communal place. Everybody was anti. I mean, you know, I don't remember people's names because they were auntie or uncle, you know, or grandpa or grandma, you know, and that's how, when we were little, I think, what was that person's name? I didn't know because I called her grandma. They didn't necessarily know my name because they called me Takoja, granddaughter, grandchild, you know. So to have that kind of society that we live in and are part of, and then trying to graduate into this one or trying to live simultaneously in this one is very different. And the system itself, from the beginning of, you know, 525 years ago, was set up to exterminate us and to get rid of us because they wanted the land, they wanted everything else, and the best possible solution for this society, this government, was to just have us be gone. So every part of everything has been under attack from the beginning. Our food, our family systems, the way we pray, our language, everything that you do to survive and to live as a human being was under attack and taken. And I have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to go into all that, but I'm sure you can Google any of it. You know, and continues. I just did a presentation at a panel at the University in Nevada, and they were talking about PTSD, and I said, well, what do you call it? Post-traumatic stress disorder, you know? But what if it's still traumatizing? What if it continues? It's not post, it's still going on. So we are surviving genocide, and those genocidal tactics are still in place. So on that hand, I am a survivor. I am successful because I've not forgotten that. I've not let go of the traditional ways of thinking and being in this world, even though everything was done to take it from me, you know. So, but with the VAWA Act, the Violence Against Women Act, that's a big thing I was thinking about when you were doing your presentation, because that was one of the things that, with the man camps that are happening from the mining, does everyone know about the mining that's happening in the proposed Keystone XL pipeline?
Who doesn't know? Please raise your hand. I just want to make sure.
Okay, I just wanted to make, yeah, thank you for asking. From beginning of time, they wanted the land, and they put, you know, moved our people here and there, and I have many stories of my one side of the family that was moved in 5 years, 5 times, and there was thousands of people in our tribe and ended up with 223. You know, in 5 years, that many people perished from the movement of moving us off the good-looking land, the resourceful land, into these barren, what they saw as barren wastelands, which then set up our reservations where we could live our little concentration camps. And then they find out that there's minerals underneath that land. So it continues, and it's horrific of what's happening because it doesn't affect just us. We're not concerned about just ourselves as human beings. We're concerned about the fish, about the insects, about everything that's related, you know. In fact, this latest emergency situation when I was home this past summer, the insect nation was coming to us and telling us that they can't lay their eggs, that they're, because of all the pesticides and everything. And if they go, we eventually go. I mean, so they're coming to us, you know, telling us these things, and we still have that connection with them. So I tell it everywhere I go, because it's so important when you're trying to grow your plants, or when you're, you know, and we just spraying Febreze, or, you know, whatever we're doing, it's like every act we do affects that whole sacred cycle, you know. So getting back to reproductive justice, there was a policy back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s where they did forcibly sterilize Native women. And I have a lot of people that I know who actually went through that, where you don't know because we had the language barrier, because from the time the legislation was set up and the boarding school systems were set up and the reservation things were set up, they had this early legislation, what they called infantilization or domestic dependency, where they don't see us as human beings, they don't see us as intelligent human beings. You know, it's like a species or something, and that's how we've always been seen, even with the mascot issue and everything. It just shows that that's still going on. People don't see us as brilliant people, or knowing, you know. It's funny when I go to Bioneers or places and they'll have these great revelations that the water is healing. It actually has healing abilities, and we're like, I've known this all along. And they say, and those who've been healed by it are more likely to try and protect it. You know, and then I'm thinking, okay, this is news. This is news to people. I mean, it is hard to understand that detachment that the society has, because for us it's all integrated, it's all the same thing. You know, so with that legislation, people were totally, like, you'd go in for a toothache or you'd go in for something and they would sterilize you. And that was part of the policy, the government policy. You know, so this has happened. And then there's the whole breakup of the family with the boarding school system. And that's my story. I didn't realize it until later on in life. But when I was, you know, my grandmother, my mother, her mother, all were part of the boarding school system. And what that is where they stole children from the people. And can you imagine, you know, as a child of that, or as one of that being my life experience, I always would think, God, that was horrible to be stolen away, to all of a sudden be in these big, you know, you're on the plains running around free, and then all of a sudden there's these big cement buildings, you know, and cement hallways, and these nuns who we thought didn't have any feet because it looked like they just floated around, you know, like some kind of scary, you know, Darth Vader sort of type of thing. And they had whips underneath their things, so you'd be playing or doing something, and then the whip would come out, you wouldn't even see it coming. You know, and I'm 6 years old, 7 years old when this is happening. So because of that, you don't bond with your mother. You don't have that initial bonding that happens. That went on for generations. And my mother was really adamant about hugging me, telling me she loved me, and all these things. But I did spend years not getting that every day, you know, and not having that. So when it became time, even though I was brilliant, I went to UC Berkeley, I, you know, did everything I could to be successful in the society, and I had my children. In hindsight, I didn't have that bond with them. I wasn't in their face. I wasn't the kind of parent that I could have been, you know, because I didn't have that. So we parent the way we've been parented. So for our people, we're still reeling from these effects because they're still happening. We have high rates of alcoholism, because of all the nuns and priests being pedophiles and sadists. We have high rates of violence, high rates of alcoholism, high rates of incest in our communities. And it just feels overwhelming. So when I go back to the reservation or go and be among my, even here in the city, you know, we see these problems. We see the effects of this genocide that's still happening. And we also see amazingly brilliant people doing their best to overcome these, to fight back, to insist on some of the things that that we fight for. And I used to spend time wondering, well, how did this happen? Why did this happen to us? Why, God? You know, I mean, it's just like when you think about it. And it's hard when I turn to my grandkids and they turn to me and say, wait a minute, you mean this was all ours? And then what happened? You know, and how do you explain genocide to your grandchildren? Because it's in the mind of a child, you're like, you know, it's amazing we're not all serial killers. So, so there's an intense level of despair and an intense level of brilliance and strength. I mean, Frank Wan, who's a rapper, a young man who's 21 years old, he just graduated from Chicago University. In one of his raps, in his song, he says, put them in our schools, put them in, make them eat our food, you know. Have any of them come to the reservation and live one day in our shoes, would they survive? And that's what I think. So I have a little bit of impatience around people who can't do it. You know, it's because we've had to do it. We've had to do it. And so, you know, when I was at UC Berkeley, or even in New Bridges, when we'd have the women's group, I would get really annoyed. And at the time, I was like, okay, am I just being a angry, mean person? But the reality is, my experience of being a woman is completely different than most people's experience of being a woman. It's just, you know, I mean, because of the sacrifices that I've seen, and the intense despair that continues, you know. But we have the amazing faith, and we have amazing hope, and we have amazing strength and brilliance, intelligence, you know. And when I asked that question, why God, why did this happen, I didn't really come up with an answer. But what I did know and realize from that, and it goes back to our elders. When I was younger, I'd be so angry, and I'd go back to the res, and I'd be like, they do this out there, and they, you know, I was like furious at the things that I saw in the society, especially pertaining to Indian people. And they would be calm, and they would be generous, you know, and I thought, how can you be that way? Why aren't you mad, you know? But it was about forgiveness. It was about the true strength and balance. There's not a story that I hear that I can't relate to in my life. As a child in those boarding schools, I was raped and systematically, you know, if you get sick, you're in the infirmary, and so you're a 7-year-old sitting duck, you know, and all the nuns and priests, everyone can come through because you're all alone. And this went on for generations of boarding schools. So when they're wanting to make Hunupera Sarah a saint, we're kind of against that, you know. Anyway, I'm kind of a little going off track there.
No, you're not.
But I forgot where I was going with that. I guess that forgiveness part is the most important part. Every time I see other Indian people, I don't care what they're wearing, if they're drunk, you know, or if they're whatever, they're survivors. You know, the horror and the experience that our children, that my grandchildren are going through, makes us really strong. And there's, like I said earlier, there's not a story I've heard that I haven't been through, you know. But instead of being angry, I chose to heal from that, and in that healing helps others, you know, to heal. And I'm not going to turn anyone away. And speaking of not turning someone away, here's a warrior in that. This woman, I don't know her real well. And when I first saw her, I was like, okay, who's this? You know, because she is not conventional in any sense of the word. And I appreciate the love and the care and the compassion, how you put your life, your walk of life on the line for our children. That's amazing in this day and age. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and turn it over to Tiny.
Wait. Before you, yes, this is what I want. Tiny, before you start, I just want to say, I want to come up because, you know, when we ask people to tell their stories, these are embodied stories. These are stories that bring up trauma, that bring up real pain, that until our society changes, we're all going to live in this re-traumatized. And so there's a whole movement that, you know, when we ask people to come and tell their stories, you know, their stories, if we're in the academy, we listen to their stories. Oh, you know, we learn about, you know, the people. Person has all the weight of what has come up. So I want to acknowledge, I want us just to sit for a minute and maybe hold a coda in this moment. And let's make, let's just affirm, you know, the well-being of the Red Nation and the children of the Red Nation. Let's hold Cody as a person, and let's hold all the generations that she's connected to, and all the bloodlines on Turtle Island.
And anywhere you walk around, know that our people are here. You know, they're below your feet. And we're still here. I joked around in Reno, I said, people get off the plane in South Dakota, they have all these pictures of red cloud and rain in the face, and all these black and white pictures, right? People want to see the dead Indians. They want to glamorize and, you know, romanticize the dead Indians, but they don't want to see us now and the result of that. And we're it. We've survived genocide. We're still doing it. So, but notice that it just sent some energy to the people that are here. You know, in the background, still trying to protect those shell mounds. Still trying to protect these places, these sacred places. You know, whether it's over on Mauna Kea on Hawaii, or whether it's Medicine Lake up here in the hills, in the Sierras. You know, we're trying to still protect the water. And the refinery walks that we've been doing, people coming together to pray for the water, you know, just for the waters, because it's alive. You know, it saved me a couple of times, or it actually moved me on a way of harm. You know, I've heard it when it's, you look and you swear someone's there and it's the water. You know, we have those relationships, you all have them too. And if you haven't developed them, you can. And they're helping us. We're gonna make it, you know. We're not gonna disappear. Thank you.
I am a poverty scholar, criminalized, racialized, and always in struggle for $1. I am a poverty scholar. All the people you don't want to see, never want to be, look away from me. What you gonna do? Arrest me? I'm in your city. I am a poverty scholar, and I rock this jailhouse attire because me and my po mama did jail time just trying to stay alive in this holler. I'm a poverty scholar, and I'm the melanin-challenged daughter of a strong black Indian mama, for without whom there would be no me. A mama soltera and a welfare queen. So I always start talking with what I call my slam bio. I'm a proud member of the Poets Project of Poor Magazine and the Welfare Queens. That's small W, capital Q. And that's different forms of cultural work and poetry, what we call poetry journalism, to take back our stories as poor people, as fetishized people, as Black and Brown and First Nations people, who are talked about but not talked with, who are silenced and whose stories are erased because we aren't the one writing them. Stories And his stories and her stories are kept in large eugenicist-funded, pimped-out institutions funded by what I affectionately call philanthropimps. And so it's intentional that the histories and the herstories are erased, and they live in the walks and the journeys and the prayers and the spirit of fierce warriors like Lakota and many others that I have the blessing to know. And so to break down my slam bio, and because this is in honor of reproductive justice and some other things that I know that you young people are, and other young strong warrior women are learning from your beautiful mentor, Risika. My story was my mom was an orphan. She is Taino, Puerto Rican, and Roma, but her situation was she was born to a Irish immigrant, Irish Roma immigrant woman who was 15 at the time when she was brought over here. And in Ireland, actually, she was cloistered in a convent. That's why you're bringing me there, because she was raped by her own father as the oldest of 13 children. And of course, one of the things that they did, I'm sure some of you might know that story, is they would square them away to convents to have the child and pretend it didn't happen, or forever banish them from the house. And I didn't know any of this until actually, as I really started to dig, because of the child and the orphaned woman, the history isn't even there, intentionally, for so many reasons. But anyway, so I started to find out that actually it was this. She was the illegitimate daughter within the family too. She was part Roma. She called herself a psychic, and she did readings and all of these things. And so of course, she was considered a witch too, and all these ways they criminalized strong women with medicine. But anyway, the nuns decided one day to send her off, and they put her on a boat to America, because everything was going to be okay here. And first thing she did was met a man who had her take care of her, and he beat her within an inch of her life, and had 3 children with this child. You know, rape has happened for centuries to women and men, of course, but to children specifically who were unprotected. And one night she got tired of it. She hit him over the head with a frying pan and ran out into the night and thought she killed him. And they never looked back. And so what did she left? She left these 3 children, right? And then she went to Philly and started doing readings, and met my grandfather, Roberto, who was this Taino African man. It was very sweet, and it was like going to take care of her. And they ended up having my mom. But, you know, the Catholicism ran deep in my grandma. And so the first thing she did is try to kill my mom. And I bring that up because I identify as a daughter, even though I'm also a mom, which is so important to me because my son saved my life. But I identify as a daughter of an in-struggle mother who barely made it. You know, our mamas who go through those things, like Lakota was talking about, how they survive. I don't buy the resiliency term. I think it's way too facile. They make it by any fucking means necessary. And I heard recently some strong indigenous women saying a similar thing, and I was really happy to hear that. They're like, no, resiliency is thrown at us so they can keep raping our land and say, well, they'll make it anyway. So I think it's an interesting metaphor there. And so no disrespect to those of you who are doing thesis essays on resiliency or any other kinds of things, but I just want to put that out there because I think that we can't make these turns up, but the things that we have to recognize is the survival by any means necessary, but that in that survival is so much broken stories and pain, right? And so in my mom's case, she was, her mom tried to sell her in the Philadelphia Inquirer because she didn't know there's some crazy global South stuff. Let me just put this child on the thing. After trying to kill her, that didn't work. And then, of course, my mom's 2-year-old body was raped 210 times by the time she was 3 years old. And the only reason I know that is that my mom speaks to me from the other side. And so as I was finishing my memoir dedicated to her, this file from a social worker came out. It was a beautiful night where Mama talked to me. She talked to me in lights, turning off and on. But literally, I was finishing the memoir, Criminal Poverty, growing up homeless in America. And she had transitioned 8 months before, but the lights all went down. They couldn't figure out why in the building. The computer shut down the whole night. I went home that night and I found a file. And I broke down because I realized, I knew my mom's pain and I knew her history before that, but I didn't know the level of what she was carrying her whole life, you know? And the strength of our mamas and how they carry these things, and they just keep on. So in her case, of course, she did just keep on, and by any means necessary, she was battered in orphanages and foster homes. She became a ward of the state. And when I was hearing Lakota's story, it's a trip because they weren't sort of the boarding houses of Native children, except that that story was very similar. And in her case, she was put in a place in Philly that was for white children, and only poor white children. And so they hid my mom, because my mom was mixed, and used to harass her and target her and mess with her all the time. And by the age of 6, she was in a trash can with this, surrounded by these bullies calling her nigger lips and doing all this weird shit. And she comes out of that, you know. She was a chameleon. She just kept on coming out, you know, and picking herself up. Like, I don't even know, right? And, but I saw some of the pictures. There's hardly any pictures, right? But there was these one at her at 4 and her at 9. And it was like something had completely changed. And to see that in a child's face is devastating. But anyway, she was an unwanted child, which is arguably one of the most dangerous things to be anywhere in the world. And the social work file actually detailed some of the moments. It was apparently her mom came back a couple times to like bring her some shoes or something out of guilt. And it's this pain you saw and the desire and those few little clinical words, it continues to mess me up. But anyway, there's my mom putting herself back together again by any means necessary. So she was gonna stay in Philly. She was caught in, like, you know, doing her gang thing and rolling up her sleeves and rolling. And they decided, you know, somebody at the Ward of the States decided to throw her out to Cali. So they put her on a bus and sent her out here with nobody. And in my mom's true typical way, she remakes herself. I decided that the way to survive was to ascend to whiteness. She gets with my colonizer dad, and everything was going to be okay. I was like Robert Redford, motherfucker. That's what he was like, you know, some surfer, and like they had some beachfront stolen property, Laguna Beach, and I mean, classic, scary colonizer scenario. Not here from Pilgrim days, but here from Gentry or something like Lord. I have his grandfather's great Lord Mayor of London. It's like really frightening to have this, but this is real, right? This is what I walk in the world. And I realize there's so many pieces in that I keep having to re-speak and re-teach on, because it's very important. It is who I am. But she went on, and so even though he left us on the street when I was 4 and tried to kill her and all these other horrible stories, because he did go to medical school and woo and went insane and some sort of like weird, like Hitchcockian colonizer story. It was like all, you know, and in the process of this, my mom's caught in this. Mom's hella ghetto, and she's like, you know, just like had no time for him and woo. But anyway, we end up on the street, and he threatened her. She went into court to try to get child custody, you know, I mean,
alimony.
Right, that he quote unquote would ruin her, and did try, in the classic 70s, you know, whatever, say she was a red whore, had a seamstress come in and say her skirts were too short, all this crazy shit. This patriarchy was deep, right? And the courts ruled in his favor, as they often do for wealthy white people, and my mom never turned back, because if she lost me, she lost everything. And so we made it by any means necessary, and once again my mom puts back everything and gets by any means necessary, gets what I call the paper, right? She got herself through school, city college to city college, got to the University of Hawaii because my mom took her out there because he could surf the big waves or some shit. All this crazy shit. And she actually was adopted by a Portuguese Hawaiian family, and it was one of the first times she felt at home, and so it was beautiful times there. And then he took her from there and went to, I was born in Camarillo State Hospital, criminally insane. That's me, right? So anyway, all that to say, fast forward, he leaves us. She gets herself back into school. She makes it. She gets an MSW after getting kicked out of being called unsupervisable for many times, because from the gate, my mom was a revolutionary and she didn't believe there's a lie of boundaries and how you couldn't touch your patients and these things, because for her, they were the same as her. Right? These were people, she was them, I'm you. But she got herself a job and got, you know, was truly practicing what we now at POR Magazine call revolutionary social work. For any of you who are going to go into that world, it means that you practice family restoration instead of family separation. These agents of the state, the CPS and et cetera, that's what they do, is practice separation. They are clearly agents. You are being groomed for that, if that's how you follow. But anyway, so she was fired from there. And for her, that was the last little murder of us all. And she did not make that psychically and physically, and she became disabled. And that's when I was 11 years old. And so at the age of 11, I dropped out of the man's school and enrolled full-time in a school of hard knocks, where I'm proud to say I have a PhD in poverty, right? Because we made it by any means. And for us, it was selling stuff on the street. And we sold art. My mom was also an artist, and we made art and sold on the street. But we had the same day as the sex workers and the what I call underground economic strategists or panhandlers. And then we all looked out for each other. So the first thing is, for poor families in the U.S., the model and the notion of homelessness needs to be expanded, because it does not at all encompass this stereotype of all of these things that they say. So first of all, there's a lot of families living like we were, houselessly in the U.S., and it isn't because of so-called substance use, which may be a way of surviving our trauma, or it may be mental illness, or it may be many things. But I just want to give you guys that as the first lesson from me. The other thing is that there are positions of fear that are so intense and that are actually supported by the state, so that if you come forward with your children in those positions, you will be criminalized. In our case, I couldn't even enroll in school because we didn't have an address. That situation pretty much still exists, although it's a little better. But if the other thing is that I needed to help my mama, and that meant helping her in all kinds of ways. And working for your family in this first world reality is not considered a valid thing to do. You were told from the gate by these age-separated schools, which are actually modeled after those boarding schools, is that separation is sanity. And we have all bought into the cult of independence and the cult of separation. So it begins at the age grade separated schools, and it moves into the concept of college, and you're going to make it if you fly 8,000 miles away and pay somebody thousands of dollars or get into debt. You're going to make it because you have become independent from those who made you, from your original teachers, from your knowledge and your ancestors and your communities of origin. And that is a lie. And that's a lie that's rooted in reproductive justice. Because if we really talk about reproductive justice, we would talk about the recreation of community and family as it was in the ways of our ancestors. And of course, these are not easy things to do when you have thousands of years of colonization or hundreds of years of colonization that have already squelched their evil ways inside of our minds so far deep that we don't even know where they began or ended. But one of the things that's really in peace about this is not just about poverty. The poverty is about the rape of abundance, because we as people all had what we needed, right? Until colonization happened. but it's also about the rape of the psyche. Because the cult of independence from all peoples is a rape of psyche. And like my mama used to say, white culture ain't good for anybody, even white people, right? The first thing that we teach our mentees who come to People School, because we have adult and children schools, is that they need to unpack the reason they're even here. These are rooted in colonization, of course, is the original gentrification, but gentrification is rooted in the cult of independence. How can you have thousands of 20-something white people flooding into this town, which is a working class people of color town, and originally a Loney territory? And we're dealing with the second colonization, who are thousands of miles away from their families. How can you have that? And they're all happily here under the lie of success because they're now making $1 million with Google and everything's cool. And right, as Lakota said, we didn't make it in the society because that society, success lie is a lie, right? How are they caring for their people? You know, how are they caring for their elders? Well, I'll tell you, because capitalism has its answer for everything. It can train other young people and other people like you to become social workers to work in elder ghettos. And a multi-million-dollar industry of foster care and elder ghettos and age grade separated schools and the nonprofit industrial complex. And so we're all like caught in this gigantic business model. We don't even know where it began or ended. And the business model is connected to everything. So I applaud all the decolonizers now who are actually taking back these stolen stories and lies with things like our own birthing processes, our own original stories, our own warrior and sacred sites as our First Nations folks are doing here, and so many other ways of collecting back and taking back these multiple lies. But one of the things I think I would like to tell you is to look at your own selves and to look at your own relationship to that. Once I was invited to come and teach at an institution like this, sort of progressive, and I was never called back. I wonder why. But I taught a lot of the young people and the other aged people is to begin by thinking why you were even there. But the last piece is to think why you are here maybe away from your families. And sometimes it's not so straightforward. Sometimes we come from families of trauma ourselves. And so I'm not putting those, hard edges on any of these lessons. But those of you who come from places and spaces where people love you, yeah, and I think that's it.
So I am a daughter of immigrants, and there are 7 sisters in my family, no boys, and actually we are a female line. Nieces, grandnieces, great-grandnieces. Not one boy in 4 generations. At any rate, and early on, as a daughter of an immigrant, I actually worked in a sewing factory at age 11 to help my mom put food on the table and pay the rent. But at any rate, that's my background and why I became a labor organizer. And throughout the 70s, I was organizing among the garment and hotel workers in the city. And in the mid-80s throughout the 90s, I continued advocating on behalf of immigrant workers only, this time as an attorney. And a couple of years back, I made that transition from labor organizing to climate justice organizing. So you're probably asking, well, what does reproductive justice have to do with climate justice organizing? And it does, and I'll get into it in 1 minute, because what I'm going to be talking about is the rape of the earth. And So I made this transition from labor organizing to climate justice organizing, and ending fracking in particular because of a number of reasons. One is because I don't want to be part of that generation that bequeaths to your generation a planet that's uninhabitable, where what dominates is the human right to food, breathable air, water, and that trumps everything else. So every movement that we've ever worked in, women's rights, civil rights, labor, immigrants' rights, it's set back. And already, because of extreme climate events, because of global warming, billions and billions of dollars is diverted into rebuilding every time a hurricane hits, every time wildflowers or drought happens. And that's the funds that's needed for education, for health care, for child care, for all the basic needs. And poverty simply rises in this type of situation. And the other reason that I made the shift was because climate change impacts low-income communities and people of color more. When extreme weather events happen, when superstorms hit, the people least likely to be able to weather it, the worst damage is to families who are uninsured, don't have health insurance, rent their homes. And you remember Katrina. I think you're all old enough to remember Katrina. And the African Americans of the 9th Ward unable to drive away from that city to flee because they had no cars and they were stranded on rooftops. They ended up in the Superdome. And 80% of the houses that were destroyed during Katrina in New Orleans were owned by African Americans. And 1 in 4 black businesses disappeared. 52% at a 52% higher rate than white businesses. And in a heat wave, African Americans are more likely to die than whites. And this is the new norm now in terms of climate change. From here on in, we are going to be in drought and heat wave because of climate change, and its impact is the greatest on people of color and low-income communities. And our continued reliance on fossil fuels means that it's the low-income communities that continue to suffer because they live next to the refineries and the coal power plants. And for those reasons, I made the shift. Climate change and global warming is the key issue of our time that drives everything. It drives our survival and drives any progress that we want to make in any of the social justice movements that we're working on. And people of color have always lived and worked in sacrifice zones, suffering from industrial toxins at home or at work, while the rest of the society has benefited from the hyper-consumerism lifestyle that was based on fossil fuels and that caused and brought about global warming. In researching for the first book I wrote, Asian American Women, Issues, Concerns, and Response of Human and Civil Rights Advocacy, I learned that a woman's freedom to conceive and to have a family and have healthy babies is linked to living and working in environments that are toxic-free, that are free from toxins. And, but Asian immigrant women, for instance, in the electronic factories of Silicon Valley, worked with chemical agents that caused spontaneous abortions. And 38% of the pregnant women in these workforces suffered from spontaneous abortions. And today in California's nail salon industry, 80% of the workers are Vietnamese immigrant women. More than half of them reproductive age. And they are exposed daily to chemicals that are linked to infertility, to miscarriages, and other reproductive harm. What we needed to realize is that today, the right to reproductive health is jeopardized for all of society with the oil industry trying to squeeze every last drop of oil on the earth, using extreme oil extraction methods like hydraulic fracturing. And the sacrifice zone has expanded beyond people of color in low-income communities. We are now all in the sacrifice zone. So fracking's impact on reproductive justice. In the fracking process, some 600 chemicals are used. 25% of them are carcinogenic, and 24 of the most commonly used chemicals, such as benzene and toluene, they're endocrine disrupting chemicals, and have been associated with infertility, miscarriages, low birth rate, etc. So studies have found that women who are exposed to toluene had unusual menstrual cycles and could not conceive. There's strong evidence of a link between oil and gas drilling and decreased semen quality in men and higher miscarriages in women. Yeah, in rural Colorado, babies living with more than 120 gas and oil wells within 10 miles had 20% more, or 20% more likely to have congenital heart defects because of exposure, maternal exposure to benzene. And in a small town in Utah, infant death rose 6 times to the normal rate of those living near, because they lived near oil wells over the last 3 years. So fracking is happening throughout the U.S. Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Ohio, in First Nation territory, in urban and rural communities, in low-income communities, and right in the middle of middle-class communities, middle-class neighborhoods. It's no longer the most vulnerable communities that are being poisoned, and fracking is starting in California. So I'm going to rewind the tape and tell you what fracking is. And you probably have all heard about fracking, but there was a description from a talk that Sandra Steingraber gave. She's a biologist and author and activist that describes in the most visual way, in a way that shows graphically how the fracking process is the earth being raped. And I wanted to, it's a little long, but I wanted to read it. The description of fracking for gas is also, that she describes, also applies to the fracking for oil. So bear with me, and I want to just read through it. Get my glasses for it. So fracked gas comes from the shale layer. And what is the shale layer? So this is how she describes it. Where did it come from? 400 million years ago, as the floor of the 400 million years ago, it was the floor of an ocean. So there were various parts of our nation, and Sandra Steingraber lives in New York. And she says, I live on top of one of them in upstate New York called the Marcellus Shale, where there were oceans that used to be in these places. It was a time in our history, in our Earth's history, when there wasn't as much oxygen yet, so the bottom of the ocean was oxygen poor habitat. When the creatures of these oceans died, they couldn't decompose the way they would now. Instead, they turned into bubbles of methane that became trapped within the sediment at the bottom of the ocean. Where I live over the Marcellus Shale, there was once a mountain range on the edge of the sea, where the Catskill Mountains are now, and that mountain range so slowly eroded. Mountains, as you know, contain lots of heavy metals. Mercury, arsenic, barium, strontium, radium, uranium. These elements too then, with the silt from the mountains, shifted down to the bottom of the ocean and became trapped within the ocean floor and all those bubbles of methane. Over millions of years and a lot of pressure, that turns into shale, a rock that has within it all those heavy metals, but also the vaporized tiny bubbles trapped within the rock. And that's what we're after with fracking. To get these bubbles to come up, you can't just stick a hole in the ground and have them rise up because the shale is tight. It will hold on to them. You have to blow the shale apart. You do this by using water as the club. So you send 2 to 8 million gallons of water down the hole, which is drilled sideways, tunneled sideways like a robotic mole, through the shale. And first, you use some explosives to start the fracking process. Then you put the water down under immense pressure, 10,000 pounds per square inch in some cases, and you fracture that layer. And the bubbles that are trapped in it for 400 million years are now for the first time able to flow. But if you just used water, you couldn't really frack, because as soon as you release the pressure of the earth pushing down on those cracks are just going to close them back up again. So what you need to do is use water as the agent, as a kind of fire hose, to shoot grains of sand into the cracks, to prop those stony doors ajar so that the bubbles can flow out. And it turns out the only kind of sand that's up for the job of fracking is silica sand. It can withstand the pressure of the earth, a mile of earth pressing down on it to hold the cracks open so the gas can flow up. So really the water is simply used to break the shale up and shove the sand grains in. And then forevermore, all the hydrocarbons trapped in that rock has a way to flow up. You can never unfracture it because it's broken apart and the sand grains propping it open. The water you shoot down there, about half of it stays trapped within the geological strata, and half the water comes flying back up with the gas. So if you figure 2 to 8 million gallons, we're talking about a few million gallons of every frac job that's now trapped within the shale, and the rest comes back up. Both of those, well, when we shoot water down into the center of the earth and it remains trapped there, we have effectively made it disappear from the hydrologic cycle. Humans have never done this before. The earth, 98% of the earth is seawater, 1% is frozen as ice caps, leaving us with only 1%, a small thimbleful of the world's total water available as fresh drinking water. Now we're shooting that water thousands of feet below the water table. It will never fall as rain again, come down as snow, glisten, or even to be a dewdrop, be juice that you drink, or coffee. It's gone forever. The water that does come shooting back up is now poisoned. And there's no technology that we know of that can unpoison it. Not only does it contain a lot of chemicals that are used in fracking, it also picks up the stuff on its journey to the center of the earth and back, including a lot of the heavy metals that have been trapped down there for millions of years, like arsenic, lead, radium. So what comes back up can be low-level radioactive and contain quite a few heavy metals. And also brine, because the ancient seawater from the ocean is still down there. And it's now much more salty than our oceans are today, 5 to 7 times more salty. So that very salty 5 to 7 times, that very salty water mixed with frac fluid also comes back up, and then requires permanent containment, for which we have no good plan. The best practice is considered in my part of the world is to take it to Ohio and shove it into deep well injection in Ohio, which now has caused earthquakes, because the fracking fluid lubricates the rocks and cause them to slide together against each other. If we just used sand and water to frack, that would also not be enough. You need to use quite a number of chemicals. Some of those chemicals are used in order to carry the sand grains around the bend. Otherwise, they would settle out. So you need something thick to carry them around. And then you need another set of chemicals to thin out the thick stuff so the gas can flow out. You need some friction reducers and scale inhibitors. But the most toxic stuff that you use are biocides, which are essentially pesticides that kill everything. Turns out the shale is actually alive. It's a living ecosystem. And in order for the gas to flow, you have to kill those organisms off, because they will grow inside the pipe and interfere with the gas flow. With fracking, we're just killing them off and exterminating them. So each of these wellheads then is a kind of chimney in the earth that is venting toxic gases, not only methane, but also the creatures that died 400 million years ago, turned into bubbles of other stuff. So there's benzene down there and toluene and so on, and these vapors too have the ability to fly out of the hole as soon as the drill bit intersects the shale. It takes 1 or 2 months to drill down to the shale and drill sideways, and during that time, whatever is down there, radon, methane, and so on, can simply vent into the atmosphere. So that is fracking. And that's the carcinogenic chemicals, the endocrine disrupting chemicals that went down the hole with the water and sand, half of it comes back up along with the millions of years of prehistoric water laced with radioactive substances now. And already in California, where they are fracking, water is being contaminated because it's seeping into the groundwater. And have you all seen the movie Gasland? Or on TV when in Pennsylvania, in Wyoming, where they frack, people living there, fracking wells turn on their water, they strike a match, and there's an explosion because there's so much methane in there. Yeah, that's what California is facing unless we stop it. So Naomi Klein, in her book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, points out that feminist scholars have long recognized that patriarchy's dual war against women's bodies and against the body of the earth were connected to that essential corrosive separation between mind and body, and between body and earth, from which both the scientific revolution and the industrial revolutions sprang. So the mindset of the 1600s scientists was man can conquer nature, man can dominate and control nature and the earth. And that mindset brought us to the point of relying on fossil fuels and the plundering of the earth to build the modern world that we live in, and that has led to extreme climate change. Scientists tell us that 80% of known fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground, otherwise we reach the tipping point for which there's no return from climate change. The remaining 20% is sufficient to bring us to 100% renewable energy. So in other words, we don't need to frack for oil or use any other kind of extreme extraction methods. And it's not necessary to put all of us at risk from toxic chemicals and the worsening of climate change so that the oil companies can continue to make super profits. And as I said, fracking is already happening in California. 90% of it is happening in Kern County, where Latino community is impacted. These frack wells are next to schools, next to residences. They're not out in rural areas. In Los Angeles, they're fracking in the Inglewood oil field, Baldwin Hills, right in the middle of middle-class African-American communities. You see fracking wells, you know, you take pictures, you see fracking wells with apartment houses right in front of them. Yeah. So with kids and bloody noses that just don't stop every single day. So, and we have to stop this, and I encourage all of you, whatever social justice movements you all end up in, then you also have to join the climate justice movement, because, and we have to speak out against fracking and against continued fossil fuel use, and become advocates for the survival of humanity, and for all the creatures on Earth. So,
I'm going to ask all the panelists to come up front, and if we have some questions for them or some comments, I don't have a question, we could do an appreciation.
I should have brought the cards. I could grab them when I come in. Sorry, we're talking about the march because we're both going to be on the walk. It'd be great if you could come. May 16th. Yeah, it's.
And you have a petition that.
And I do have a petition that I like to circulate to Jerry Brown to stop fracking.
Is it an emergency petition people can sign?
Yes.
Okay, we'll pass this around. I have a pen.
You know, when I was younger and was being an activist and growing up as an AIM youth and Women of All Red Nations, you know, all the things that we were trying to do to get the world to listen to what we were saying then, which is now happening, is that we didn't have the access. So we would do like a run to the prison or do things and pass out flyers to try and say, this is what's going on. The shame of our generation now is that we have the information. I mean, you have things on Netflix like House of Cards or Scandal or things on television that show blatantly that these politicians are greedy and evil and, you know, and we're just allowing them to still kill us. And I don't understand. I mean, it's just, it's amazing, you know, and this fracking stuff, it's, you know, and it's hard because as indigenous people of this land, that the role, the definition of a two-legged or a human being is to protect, because we have, what my uncle used to say, that we were cursed with the power of reason, because every other living being just does what it does instinctively. We have the power of reason, and because of that, we used it in a not so good way. But we who know and have the original instructions to take care of each other, what she was talking about. I love that breakdown, by the way. But, you know, it's our instinct, too, to take care of what's around us, to take care of those around us. And this fragging stuff, it's like, it's a science fiction horror story. And we're living in it, and I don't understand why it's not an emergency. You know, so these walks are one way that we put our, I mean, it's just a powerful thing. I have a picture of my grandson, you know, he's 15 years old and he's carrying that prayer staff and leading this walk past shell oil and, you know, praying for the water. And I asked him afterwards, I was like, how was that for you? Because I'm trying not to, he wants to play Minecraft and he's like every other kid, right? And I said, how was that for you? And he goes, I could feel them all with me. You know, he could feel, and he's not talking about us as people, but the ancestors, you know? So we have that connection, we have that power, we have the ability to do the right thing. And when I was young and they talked about this coming, that we were gonna go into this time of purification, when it was gonna get worse, that we are gonna survive it, but we have to pay attention to it. We have to take care of our elders, our children, the animal, you know, we have to actively do that. And we'll make it through this, you know? We are gonna make it through this. Maybe I won't, but we will. You know, our children, our grandchildren will.
I want to appreciate this as a very, very powerful panel. I left, I want to apologize, Laura, because I wanted to find out my last speaker who was ill and, you know, woke up this morning, was going to call me, then fell asleep, and just at 2:30 was sending me a email. She couldn't make it. So, but I want to acknowledge the combined wisdom and the commitment to make change that is sitting in front of us. And also the links, you know, I want to, Tiny and Lakota, for not romanticizing our families. I too come from a very abusive family lineage, you know, so I hear that, and it's really important to be able to name that and also look at what we all did with those lineages. One of the things that I say is that 50, you know, 20, you're finding yourself, 30, you're experimenting, you know, 40, it was, well, everything I did was fine because I learned from it. And then 50, it was this, I get to look and see what I would not do again and how it affected my child. So I really resonate, you know, with you, Lakota, you know, noticing that. I really want to, you know, really appreciate for your bringing into the room these living legacies of colonialism and racism and greed and how they intertwine, and how, Laura, what you're talking about is again that legacy, and then how capitalism is putting it forth, and talking about the ways that even middle class college, you know, yes, Native women were sterilized in the 1000s. Yes, Black women were sterilized. Yes, children were taken away, and middle class white women in college are still a targeted group. You know, and thank you for your work in bringing that forth and helping to organize against it. Because I saw the hunting ground, I think the statistic was like either 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 college women is going to suffer rape or attempted rape. And there was a very wonderful, sad piece about what would it mean if, you know, in the welcome, we're so glad to have accepted your son, daughter to school. Your child has a 1 in 4 chance of getting raped. But, you know, welcome to university, and how nobody would send their kids to school. So I really want to thank you for that.
I just wanted to add to that because I think that there is, you know, ancestors and Creator always, I realized as tired as I was today, I really had a lot of trouble getting it out, be real, because we just did, we're doing day school with children and it was a hard week. But anyway, I just felt when I was in this room hearing the stories and the power of all of you, I was like, oh, that's why I'm here, right? We already know the connecting the dots, and I feel like when Lakota said about, you know, I'm not sure the words you used, but one of mine is the forgiveness, and my catchphrase is the coming with love, no matter who it is and what it was. but that's a hard one, right? In the revolution especially, because we tend to have revolutionary turf wars, and I'm working with that myself, and to actually, humble revolutions are possible. Actually, one of our Poor Press books was a decolonizer's guide to a humble revolution, and we put it out at the Occupy time. Like, this is, you know, Occupy had all this beautiful blah blah blah, but it was also, it did some weird kind of harm by not recognizing who came before and recognizing the eldership and the work that had already been there. And so it wasn't that we were trying to stop it or put, you know, any kind of disrespect on folks stepping up, but more like, how can we actually connect dots, right? And so, you know, one of the things, the reason that I talk about what I call the cult of independence, and especially with folks in schools, is that through revolutionary work, as well as through education and art, I'm really looking at trying to connect dots, you know, because we do, no matter where we come from and what walk we're walking, we do have this goal for caring, you know, caring and loving, and it kind of like finding that place. And so we're actually going to do this big action. It's called California for Rich People Only. First Nations, Black, Brown, and Poor people standing together. Now, that's a huge group of folks, right? And we don't all completely believe or do or work on the same things at the same time, right? But we're doing it statewide. And so we're working with folks in LA and Vallejo and Sacramento, and it's been really powerful to talk to folks and try to keep them, well, let's all agree where we do agree, right? But going back to self and the connecting of the dots, I think the hardest thing, especially for us folks who come from trauma, and the one lesson I want to give, because I feel like if I've done nothing else in life, it's walking the walk by any means necessary. And my mom was not an easy person to deal with. She was a woman of trauma, and she was grumpy, she was, you know, ghetto, and she was an elder. And things weren't always cute. We didn't walk like a Winnie the Pooh thing into the sunset. But I stayed with her till the day she transitioned, as the ways of my ancestors do. We did not separate in these ways. And that isn't to say, again, not holding the ways in which a lot of us are in danger in our own homes because of different reasons. And sometimes you have to. But I want to put that out to those of you, because one of the things my mom always used to say to me, which was complicated, is she goes, I put all my energy in you, and you're a strong, young motherfucker. So you do need to take care of me. And, you know, that was her also speaking our indigenous past and not buying into these ghettos that are also happily there for us and funded and creating jobs, oftentimes in the clinical psych and social work, you know, degrees. And it's really hard to say that to folks who are about to get maybe an MA or a BA. Oh, you mean to tell me my job isn't actually there and it's good? And I'm not trying to say that, folks, but what I'm trying to say is infiltrate when you manifest, you know, infiltrate to create, as I often say. So if you're going into those social work positions, you know, take those chances, and not to disrespect your families who might have paid your tuitions, and to come with love and respect, but to recognize that actually decolonization starts with y'all. And there it goes all the way back to the circle of what we beautifully heard, this metaphor of raping Mother Earth and raping our young people in these institutions. I have a problem with institutions where young 18 to 24-year-olds are all alone, left on a campus. Those are children. And I love the work that you're doing. But for me, too, just to throw this and but piece in it, I have a problem. I'm so glad you're doing it, because I have a problem with these institutions who encourage and are part of an end game in the cult of separation. And then you have all these young people just hanging out with themselves, with no elders and with no ancestors and with no protection. And so thank God you're there putting those pieces in place. But also to go back and recognize the ways in which these institutions are constantly working to undergird that separation. And then that's how we can kind of be on our phones and our iPads and our this and not recognize that that led to Fukushima, and that leads to this desire for this constant energy. We gotta have more energy no matter what, who it kills, who it doesn't, and now we're right back at home. So anyway, that's my just challenge to you all to think about.
And we've had some concluding comments from Lakota and Tiny. I want to ask Sophie or anything else you would add?
No, I'd be curious if there's any questions.
Yeah.
I'll pass this around, by the way, to people. Oh no.
Give me another one. I'll put it on the board.
Yay.
Okay.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your insights. I feel very privileged to be here today, to hear your wisdom, and for having the opportunity to share my experiences. I think I don't know, there are so many things. I'm very grateful to have been here and for your stories. And I wish that more people would be able to hear them. And something that I thought of while you were talking is that I recently read this book by Timothy Mitchell. I don't know if you're familiar. It's called Carbon Democracy. And he talks about the intersections between the labor movement and the development of industrialization and energy, and how we transition in the United States from being a coal-based to oil-based economy, in part because it helped undermine labor. Because coal is something where people were able to organize at the nodes of vulnerability. So like you had lots of workers who were working in the same area, and so they were able to disrupt the functioning in a way that you couldn't do with oil, which was in these remote areas that was much more automated. So actually pipelines, oil pipelines were specifically created to usurp labor. That's specifically why we have them. And so that is something that
I know.
I know. So it is really, everything is really intersectional. Everything is interrelated. All of these different struggles are intertwined. And so I thought that that would be something to bring up and to recommend that book, Carbon Democracy.
I actually do have some parting thoughts, and that is, I mean, it seems so overwhelming, but I think that big oil has pushed us too far, and I think that, and there is now a groundswell of grassroots, a movement to fight back against big oil, you know, and Richmond Chevron was, and that whole struggle was one of them, and I don't know if you followed, but I think at least 3 city council people and the mayor was up for re-election, and Chevron spent $3 million to try to put their candidates in, and the community united and beat back Chevron. You know, kept the mayorship and the 3, and it's happening community after community, and last year there were 4 communities that gathered enough signatures to put a ballot measure on their county ballot to ban fracking. And that's pretty impressive, 4 counties. And 2 won and 2 didn't, but I spent almost 5 months full-time in San Benito County, which is in Hollister, you know, where Pinnacles National Park is, helping them run their campaign, because these were entirely grassroots campaigns, right? And in a county as small as San Benito, you don't have the senior organizers that you have in the Bay Area, right? So I'm retired, and I figure the next 10 years I've already decided I am devoted to climate justice organizing, and what I can do, what my contribution is to lend my organizing experience to help them run their campaign. So, and it's happening, you know, county by county. Hermosa Beach won a ban fracking by 80%.
Yeah.
You know, and the more big oil pushes, it has created this grassroots movement. Some San Benito County now has people who were never part of the environmental movement, who stood up to fight against big oil, and now are experienced enough to do more, you know, organizing of whatever issue comes up, and it is developing this network of grassroots activists that can take on big oil, you know. So I think I see the positive and the hope in our movement. Yeah. Actually, one other parting shot, and that is labor. I was a union organizer for 20 years or longer. I represented immigrant garment workers, I represent construction workers, etc. But labor has been part of the problem, and what it is labor fought with the capitalists for the share of the wealth that was created by fossil fuel, right? And it hasn't been able to move past that paradigm, and right now it's just defending all the jobs in the dirty industry instead of thinking about how do we create a green world with good jobs.
Yeah.
And you all need to know that while carbon emissions are dropping in this country and increasing in China because of all the coal, 48% of the carbon emissions in China is for production of goods for our country. It is our consumerism that is driving climate change and carbon emissions. So don't go blaming the Asian countries. It is us that continues to be a consumer society that is driving climate change.
I want to say I am so thankful that we did videotape your wisdom. Really, really thankful, because this really deserves.
That's how I feel about it. It's like, you know, Arisa kind of knows this, and it's, when I say trauma's still happening, it's like you do everything to do better by your children and by your, you know, and every grandmother's worst nightmare is that their grandchildren are at risk, and my grandchildren are at risk, and right now I'm in custody of them for the weekend. I get them on weekends. And so it's always a struggle for me. Do I leave them to come and do this? But I'm doing this for them, you know, and we have to, we have to do this. We have to stop them. We have to do whatever it takes. And I've been doing this all my life. I haven't took a couple of years where I'm tired of this. I don't want to be Indian anymore. I don't want to, you know, because as a Native person, people can say they're Native and use it for whatever cultural capital they want, or, you know, people do that. I see it a lot. But for me, it means that I'm related to everything. It means that this earth is depending on me. You know, and all of us in our original teachings, no matter where we come from on this planet, that was your teaching, that you are related to everything, and it's your relatives, it's your family. So whatever ways you find, we all have amazing gifts. And the one last thing I want to say is that when I was a teenager and I was, you know, we knew this uranium mining was happening in the Black Hills. They were coming after it. They wanted to flatten the hills. That was their slogan, because they wanted the water mostly, but also the gold, of course, and uranium, everything else that's in there. So there I was, a young person, thinking, how can they do this? You know, how can they be so greedy? I couldn't understand it. And what our ancestors said then to us, because we still have our traditional ways, you know, we still have that way of communicating, connecting with our ancestors. And they said, we're coming, we're going to help. We're coming now, because we see what's going to happen. So if you were born in the 80s or the 90s, that's you. You came to help. You know, you came to make a difference. That's why you have this calling, you know. And so thank you. Thank you for coming, for making the sacrifices that you're making, because you're the answer to our prayers. You know, as a kid, I was saying, we need help against this, what's going on here. Because I was raised with no illusions. I did never believe this government was, you know, the Ozzie and Harriet mindset that everyone had, because my people knew, you know. So, and we still know. So I appreciate the commitment that you make, and the decision, and write it down. Start writing. Our ancestors talk to us all the time. Whether you're writing, whether you're drawing, they're trying to tell you things. Your ancestors, your great-grandmas, your great-great-grandpas that you've never even met. But they're there with us. And we had that. That was normal for us. It's just that the society has chopped that all up over, you know, everyone's colonized, everyone's been, that was amazing, this individual. I love that breakdown. I can't wait to see this video and share it with everybody, because that was a good breakdown of this ghetto of individuality, of separating yourself, the amnesia that everybody carries with them, because they don't work. You know, in my workshops I'll say, how many of you remember your grandpa? And some people raise their hands and I say, do you know their faces? Do you know their names? Okay, how about your great-grandma? And nobody remembers. We're so separate from each other. Whereas in the indigenous way and in your original way, everybody's brother and sister. You know, people say to me and joke with me, now is this your real brother or is this somebody, you know, because everybody I introduce, this is my brother, this is my sister, you know, but that's the way that we survive. That's the way we're meant to be. We're related to everything. I just want to say one thing. You know, change the voice in your head. You did nothing wrong. You are not less than. Your words are powerful. You don't have to get anything out of your butt or whatever you said. You know, I'm sorry. I didn't say that. That's the first thing I noticed is that self-judgment. Let go of that. Your ancestors didn't go through losing their languages and their names and everything so that you could beat yourself up. Be proud of who you are every minute. Look in the mirror and say, damn, you're good looking, you know? And say that with everything you do, because that's where we come from. That's what we've been, you know, beat down so much, but you know what? You are everything, every hand, every cell, every shoulder, every breast, every nose comes from one of those ancestors. So when you put that down, you're putting them down. You know, put them up and say, thank you for this nose, thank you for these thighs. You know, whatever is that voice in your head, that's the biggest crime, especially against women. That's the biggest crime, is how we build a cage around ourselves. Nobody's building around you, we're doing it ourselves. Let go of that. Don't put yourself down, or don't, you know, the first thing said, oh, I gotta do that. Let that go. Change the wording. Say, you know, I'm right.